Hi, welcome to the Accountant Guy. Today we are going to learn how you can build this expense tracker and spend money as required. In this expense tracker, you will find an overview of total expenses, which shows an overview of total budgeted expenses, total actual expenses, differences, and change in percentage. Along with that, you have expenses categorized as needs, desires, and wants. Then we have top 10 expenses highlights, which reflect the top 10 expenses incurred during a period, the least 10 expenses incurred during the period, and the recent expenses incurred during the period. Then we have the actual versus the budget expenses part, wherein we will find the expenses divided into 6 heads as seen here. This indicates the total budgeted expenses, total actual expenses, difference, and the change in percentage as well. Then we have the expenses overview during the period, where the expenses are categorized into months divided into 4 quarters. Under each quarter, for each month you will find the total expenses incurred and the proportion of the expenses to the total expenses. Then we have expenses overview in percentage, where we can find expenses categorized into 6 heads. Under each head, we can find the total expenses and the proportion of the expenses to the total expenses. Finally, we have the frequency of expenses, which indicates how frequently you incur an expense, categorized into daily expense, one-time expense, weekly expense, monthly expense, quarterly, half-yearly, and annually. Under each head, you will find the total amount of expenses incurred and the sources of expenses for each head. Now let's start building this expense tracker. In order to build this expense tracker, we will have to build 7 databases for the tracker. We will start off with expense details, which showcases the details related to expenses. Then we will create an expense source, which will have expenses categorized under 6 heads of expenses with subsequent analysis. Then we will have a frequency of expenses, which will showcase how frequently you can incur an expense. Then we will have total expenses, which will reflect the total expenses incurred for all 6 heads with the categorization of expenses as actual, budgeted, difference, and change for each. Then we will have period of expense, which will specify monthly expenses for the entire year, and it will also help us categorize expenses into different categories with the proportion of each. Then we have expense budget classification, which will help us classify the expense into 6 heads of expense with each one having budgeted expenses, actual expenses, differences, and the change in both. Then we finally have the expense categories, which will reflect the expenses as per needs, wants, and desires. This will further do more analysis on expenses for each type of expense. Now let's start building the expense details database. Let's start building the expense details. Here we will be specifying the details related to each individual expense. The first column we have of expense details has a title property. This shows individual expenses that we incurred during a period. Next up we have the period of expense, which is related to another database, that is period database, wherein we are specifying each individual month for which an expense is incurred. Then we have expense source, which is related to the expense source database, which specifies the source of expense under which an expense is incurred. Then we have the frequency of expense, which is again a relation property related to the frequency of expense database, that indicates how frequently we incur an expense. Then we have expense categories related to the expense categories database, which specifies the category for each individual source of expense. Then we have an actual expense. This is a number property wherein we are specifying the actual amount of expense incurred for the period. This is indicated in the form of US dollars. Finally, we have the budgeted expense. This is the budgeted expense estimated for each month specified in US dollars. At the bottom, we can find the sum of actual and budgeted expenses. This is how we are going to build the expense details database. Let's move to the next one. Now we are dealing with the expense source database. In this database, we are specifying the 6 different sources of expenses under which an expense is incurred. The first property is the source of expense, given a title property. This specifies one among the 6 heads of expenses for which an expense is incurred. Then we have the actual expense, which is a roll-up property that is rolled up from the expense details database, giving the actual expense amount values given in a sum format. Similarly, we have the budgeted expense, which is a roll-up property that is rolled up from the expense details database, giving the budgeted expense amount values given in a sum format. Finally, we have total expenses. This is again a roll-up property that is derived from the total expenses database that extracts the total actual expenses amount showing the original value for it. Then we have difference, which is nothing but a formula that shows the difference between actual expenses and budgeted expenses. Then we have the change in percentage, which is the difference divided by the budgeted expense amount. The formula is calculated to give a percentage. This is represented in the percentage format, giving the percent value in the end. This is how we prepare the expense sources database. Let's move to the next one. Now we are calculating the frequency of expenses in this database. Essentially, we are calculating how frequently we incur an expense and do further analysis on the same. So the frequency column is denoted by the title property specifying each individual mode of frequency. Then we have a relation property related to the expense details database that relates the different types of expenses specified in the expense details database earlier related to each type of frequency. Then we are specifying the sources of expense, which is nothing but a formula that calculates the unique sources of expenses for each. So here it is: commutation expenses written twice, thus it's one source of expense. Similarly, there is house rent and Netflix subscription, thus it's two sources of expense. Credit card payments, which are one type of source of expense. Similarly, there are consultant fees and credit card, which is two different source of expense. We have Spotify subscription, which is one source of expense. This is how the frequency of expenses is calculated. Let's move on further. Now we are calculating the total expenses incurred during the period. Here we are having four properties that are total actual expenses, total budgeted expenses, difference, and the change in percentage. For each individual property, we have linked all 6 expense heads, giving us the total actual expense, budgeted expenses, and the amount corresponding to each property as specified. Total actual expenses is a roll-up property, where we are calculating the total expenses from the expense source database, giving us the sum value for each. Then we have total budgeted expense, which is a roll-up property, calculating the total budgeted expenses from the expense source database, giving us the sum value for each. Finally, we have an amount column, which is a formula property deriving the necessary values as specified in the name property earlier. This means it will get the actual expense value if the name property has total actual expenses, it will get the budgeted expense value if the name property has total budgeted expenses, and the difference if the name property has the difference. In the end, it calculates the change in percentage if the name property has change in percentage. This is calculated with the difference divided over the budgeted expense value. This completes the total actual expense. Let's move ahead. Next up, we have the period of expense database. Here we have specified for each month for the expense and do further analysis on the same. This is month column having a title property. Here the month for each expense is specified. Then we have expense details, which is nothing but relation property that is related to the expense details database that calculates the expenses incurred each period. Then we have the expenses for each month, which is a roll-up property derived from expense details database, calculating actual expense value, giving the sum of it. Then we have total expenses, which is a roll-up property calculated from the total expense database, giving total actual expense value, giving the original value of it. Then we have the proportion of the total expense, which is formula property calculating the expenses divided by the total expenses. It is denoted in percentage in a red bar. Then we have the total expenses. This is relation linked to the total expenses database, which derives total expenses value for us. Now let's check next database. Now we have the expense budget classification, which necessarily classifies the expenses under 6 heads and gives the details related to the total actual expenses, total budgeted expenses, difference, and change in percentage for each head of expense. The first property is the title property where we have specified the required properties for use. Then we have a relation property relating to the expense source database where we have specified individual heads of expense. Then we have the amount. This is a formula property that derives the total actual expenses to travel and transportation, the total budgeted expense to travel and transportation, and the difference to the same head. Next up we have a change in percentage, which is the difference divided by the budgeted expense under a formula. Then we have a COLLAB property deriving the same values from the expense source database, giving the expense values and calculating the sum of it. Similarly, we have the budgeted expenses, which is a COLLAB value again related to the expense source database, giving the expense values and calculating the sum of it. Then we have the change in percentage, which is a roll-up value derived from the expense source database, giving us the change in percentage and showing the original value for the same. We also have the difference column, which is a roll-up property giving the difference between the budgeted and actual expenses. We need to repeat the same columns for all 6 heads of expenses to complete the database. Let's move further. Finally, we have the expense categories, which specify the 3 types of expenses, that is needs, wants, and desires, which we talked about earlier. The first column is the title property we talked about earlier. Then we have a relation column, which is related to the expense details database, that captures all the expenses related to needs, wants, and desires separately. Then we have the expenses amount. This is the actual expenses incurred, which is a COLLAB property. This is derived from the expense details database, giving us the actual expense amount and calculating the sum for it for each individual type of expense. Then we have the total expenses, which is a roll-up property derived from the total expenses database, giving us the sum of all the expenses combined. This is how we complete the expense categories database. Let's look at the primary dashboard and its presentation. This is the primary dashboard of the expense tracker. At first, we have overview of total expenses, which is linked to the total expenses database set out in a gallery mode of view. Then we have 3 categories of expenses linked to the expense categories database given in a gallery format. We need to put the database in a 3-column format just by typing / and 3-column to get the presentation. Then we have the top 10 highlights, where we have sorted out the data as per our requirements. This is linked to the expense details database set out in a list format. We have sorted the recent expenses as created time in descending order. The least 10 expenses are sorted as actual expenses in ascending order, and the top 10 expenses are sorted in descending order. Then we have actual versus budgeted expenses, linked to the expense budget classification database set out in a gallery format. Then we have an expenses overview linked to the period database, given in a gallery format. We have applied the filter for each quarter, filtering the necessary months for each quarter. Then we have an expenses overview section, where we have linked this to the expense source database set out in a gallery format and repeated for all heads of expenses. Finally, we have the frequency of expenses linked to the frequency of expense database given in a gallery format and enabled the desired properties. I hope you found this helpful. You can download this template from the link in the description.